Hi, and welcome to High Street Matters, a podcast from Bira, the British Independent Retailers Association. I'm Jeff Moody, and I'm here today to discuss what is obviously a misconnect between what the government's rhetoric is and what's actually happening in the high street in terms of support. I think one of the most interesting things is the changes in statements coming out. But for me, I think the government has just announced some £150 million worth of high street investment. They're going to come out with a high street strategy. But when it comes to business rates relief, they've chosen only to help pubs, giving them a 15% discount while independent retailers get absolutely nothing. And here's a crucial statistic. Only 32% of pubs are actually on the high streets. This comes as new research from Southampton University warns that Labour face an electoral wipeout unless it tackles high street decline. Voters rank their high streets as the third most important local issue. So joining me today, I'm delighted to have Andrew Goodacre, the CEO of Bira, who, as we know, has been challenging the government on their selective approach. And also pleased to welcome back John Jones, who's the managing partner of Philip Morrison Sons, a long-established family-run department store in Hereford. So, Andrew, let's open up with you. I believe you've called the government's announcement about pubs a fundamentally misdirected. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I will. It's just wrong, to be honest, to put it in simple terms. That stat you mentioned, Jeff, 32% of pubs on high streets. Bearing in mind the rhetoric coming from Treasury has been that their decision made for pubs has been about communities and about high streets. Now, I live in a large village where I'm pleased to say there's 4 or 5 pubs, and not one of them sits on the high street as we know it. I'm not saying they're not important businesses; they absolutely are. I used to work in the pub sector many years ago, and I do think they need help, but they don't need help at the expense of any other business on the high street. We're all sharing the same set of problems. We're all sharing the same set of challenges. And it just seems odd, really. When we first started doing reliefs on business rates, which started in 2019, it wasn't a COVID thing. It was 2019, pre-COVID. It was always retail, hospitality and leisure. And it was done that way because the government at the time recognised that retail, hospitality and leisure occupy the same space on the same high streets and need the same support. And for some reason, this policy seems to ignore that good practice and simply just look at not just hospitality, but one small part of hospitality.
Yeah. So, John, when you heard that pubs were getting a 15% discount on their business rates, while shops like yours that have been on the high street for years got absolutely nothing, can you put into words what your reaction was?
Well, initially I was baffled because the announcement kind of snuck out and we hadn't got any detail and so on. But as it became clear that it was just pubs, I just became more and more baffled because we've really all got the same pressures. We've got minimum wage, national insurance, business rates, utilities, etc. But in retail, we've also got this retail crime epidemic of theft from the shops, meaning that we've got all those costs and all this stuff going out that's not being paid for, which is something that pubs don't suffer from in the same way. So I don't understand how they've come to this conclusion and decided that one is more important than the other to the part of the community that they form. They're all needed, they're all necessary, and it just makes no sense.
No, I appreciate that. And Andrew, in terms of the government keeps saying it wants thriving high streets, but how does helping businesses that mostly aren't on the high streets achieve that?
Well, it doesn't directly, no, and I think what John just said echoes that as well. This is a kind of odd policy, and one can only imagine made for political reasons as opposed to economic reasoning. When we think about thriving high streets, and we all know good high streets, we've all used them over the years. We think of diverse nature of the businesses available to people. And if you want to think about the the best way to create a thriving high street. Think about what people need. People need places to live. We need places to eat, shop, drink, relax. We need safety. John talks about retail theft, antisocial behaviours, just as detrimental on a high street. We need people to feel a sense of pride and a sense of community. Now, not one sector will create all of that. You need that diversity. You need that range of businesses. And not all businesses. You need cultural aspects in there. You need leisure aspects in there. And I would argue one of the biggest opportunities we have is to bring health services back into high streets so that people come in to town centres and places in order to access the NHS. So there's many things we can do. Supporting pubs alone on over and above what they already get is not a plan that would deliver a thriving high street.
Yeah. So, John, your shop is right in the middle of the high street in Hereford. What would actually make Hereford High Street survive? What suggestions have you got?
Well, there's two areas I think are really important for the government to change. I think the 150 million that they've talked about the support is almost pointless. It goes nowhere at all. You know, when you consider that repaving a decent street cost about £5 million, you know, you can do nothing with 150 million. Whereas if you set up a tax regime that actually allows businesses to thrive, the high street will help itself, and then the support like the 150 million won't be needed, because the shops will be occupied, because the businesses can be viable and make money. So the first thing I think is a fundamental overhaul so that you've got a tax regime that allows businesses to thrive. And the second thing is planning reform so that particularly historic city centres can actually have a purpose and they're not being completely handicapped, that any empty unit, you can't do anything with it because you can't get through planning or building regs or whatever it may be. And if you completely reform those two areas, city centres and high streets could take care of themselves.
Okay, appreciate it. And we'll probably expand on that in a while. I think, Andrew, obviously following on from this £150 million high street investment the government announced, I'm sure that Bira will have welcomed this, but there are caveats. Could you explain what kind of caveats Bira have got on this investment?
Yeah, I think, and we do welcome it. I mean, we should naturally welcome any extra money that's coming into supporting high streets. And this is on top of the hundreds of millions of pounds committed through Pride in Place. That's already been committed as well. So the positives are that it's a recognition that places need money. It's being spent at a very local level. It's local decision makers making those decisions. I think they're setting up something called neighbourhood boards. So those are the good things about it. But the caveats, John's just touched on one that with this local decision making, will local businesses be given a chance to have an influence on some of that? What we don't want is a series of pet projects that people have, influential local people picking up pet projects that seem great, but actually don't actually have any sort of community value whatsoever in many ways. And I guess whilst we support local decision making, it's down to the quality of that decision making whether it works or not. And I do wonder whether there's a piece missing. We used to have something called the High Street Task Force that allowed local authorities to get advice, get insight, get understanding from an independent body that understood high street development, mainly on a bigger scale, the sort of town centres, the large cities. But some of that learning should be funneled down to the local area so that people making informed decisions, as well as just their local insight being put to good use as well. So we just want to be sure it's well spent, and it's not, and it does have a business focus, not just a local let's clean up this area, let's bring this old building back into use, without thinking what the business impact or business opportunity could be.
Yeah, that's probably an area I want to ask John about. So £150 million sounds a lot of money, John, but if that improved the high streets in Hereford with better shop fronts and kind of restored buildings and some facilities, but your business rates kept rising and shops kept closing, would it make much of a difference to the high street in Hereford?
Well, no, because you could have a beautifully paved street with lots of beautiful shop fronts, But if businesses can't afford to be in those units because their rent and rates and all the other bills are crippling them, then you've just got a nice looking but empty high street as opposed to a grotty looking but empty high street. So, we all know that it goes hand in hand, that as a general rule, you'll attract, more punters and better businesses when places look better. But actually, without a business rates regime and other costs that allow businesses to thrive, it won't matter how tidy and good looking the place is.
Yeah. And I think, Andrew, I've read, and you stated quite clearly that the government have reduced business rates relief by some 2.5 billion, and it's going down to about 900 million pounds relief. But they will be creating an extra 10 billion in rates revenue by 2030. So how does that kind of reduction in support but increases in costs, how does that square with trying to claim that you want to support the high street?
Well, it's contradictory, isn't it? And bearing in mind that alongside other statements that's been made by this government on high streets, we have a small business minister who's developed a small business strategy, and part of that strategy is supporting high streets. Business rates and reform of business rates being one way of doing it, and yet in 2024, going back to a time when the relief for retail, hospitality and leisure altogether was 75% with a £110,000 cash limit. That was valued at costing 2.5 billion to the Treasury. That's a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but that's for all three sectors. This transformation has been promised, where we brought in lower multipliers, this Treasury and the government like to focus on, but those lower multipliers are actually increasing the business rates for the smaller businesses, reducing the rates paid by larger ones, the exact opposite of what expected. But that is valued at 900 million. So that's a 60% reduction in essential business support to maintain not just retail, but hospitality and leisure in a meaningful, and help their business model function and develop in a very competitive marketplace. And that just shows a government that doesn't really understand the business model of high street businesses, the finances associated with high street businesses, and the risk they're placing in increasing the failure rate of high street businesses. Now, they will argue to bring in transitional relief, but they've had to do that because they've missed this opportunity to make a real difference. And the opportunity is even more stark, and I don't want to get too complex here, but business rates is worth £32 billion this year in income. It should increase, I think, by no more than inflation each year. It will increase by £10 billion over 5 years, which will be much. I hope that's much more than inflation, in fairness, because that bodes difficult times for us if it isn't. But at 10 billion, they could afford to drop the multipliers even lower, so that they still gain inflationary levels increase on business rates over 5 years, but not the 10 billion. The lower multipliers at the lower level for the high street businesses, not the retail parks, they get plenty of help along the way. But for high street businesses in retail and leisure, I think would pay for the 2.5 billion support that we had 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that kind of rationale is quite straightforward. And I personally can't understand how the government can't follow it. But let's talk about that Southampton University research I mentioned. And I'll quote the words in it. And it says that Labour, I think we've said that, Andrew, Labour will be washed away in a tide of discontent unless it addresses high street decline. I mean, that's a pretty stark statement, Andrew, from yourself. I mean, do you think that's probably the case?
Yeah, I mean, it's not from me. It's from the survey, actually. I think the survey is saying that voters will vote for alternative parties, probably Reform, because they're so unhappy seeing their high street decline. And it's not just lots of empty units. It's not just lots of boarded up shops. It's to do with antisocial behaviours, a lack of policing, the lack of care and attention being paid to these valuable places. Now, normally, this kind of feedback occurs at the point of election, when MPs or prospective candidates are knocking on doors and the general public are telling them to sort out the high street. what this research is telling a government less than 2 years into their term, that they are running a real risk if they are seen as presiding over the decline of high streets, because the general public will not vote for government now that doesn't have a clear plan, and not just a clear plan, but a really well-funded plan, and a sense of determination to bring high streets back to life.
Yeah, and I think we alluded
this is partly why I'm convinced that they've had a U-turn on welfare cuts, a U-turn on pensioners and winter fuel allowances, a U-turn on farmers and inheritance. And I think the pubs decision was political, because I think they felt pubs were meant so much to communities. They're uniquely English, British, UK establishments, and often have that very strong community feel. And I think they've gone down that route for pubs because they think this is the area they need to assuage people's fears. They ignore the high street at their peril based on that survey.
Yeah, and the concern is, I think we alluded earlier, that the high street is in the top 3 reasons locally affecting people's kind of issues and votes. And I think, John, do you sense that connection in Hereford, in your community, in terms of how the high street looks and feels, and it reflects whether the government really cares about your area?
I think it does, and I think they're failing to understand its place in society. It's not just for shopping, but you've got this sort of retail therapy bit to it that is so important to the community. And that's not just because people enjoy shopping, but in stores like ours, it's people actually enjoy talking to people, familiar faces, all those kinds of things. And that's an important form of contact, an important part of the community. And there's another aspect that we've touched on with antisocial behaviour and so on, that the high street is declining because of retail theft that I mentioned, but also money laundering businesses. That a huge number of businesses that are surviving on high streets now are Chinese nail bars, Turkish barbers, etc. Which it's not sort of stating something that's not known, that these units are generally for money laundering, and landlords would prefer not to have them. But the reason landlords go down that route is because no viable businesses, no legitimate businesses can survive. And so all these things feeding into a sort of decline that make them unpleasant places to be, even when some of the units are occupied, and detract from that sense of community that is so important.
Yeah, and I think reading that analysis from The Guardian, that some 8,000 retail outlets have disappeared off our high street since 2019. I mean, I'm staggered that 1,700 department stores now down to 1,000, and we'll come on to that because that's your area. But clothing shops are down 13%. But the strange dichotomy of that, in restaurants are up from 17,000 to 25,000, and vape shops, as you mentioned, are up 38%. So, Andrew, what does this tell us? What's happening on the high street?
I think those figures really just confirm what we've seen over the years now, and it is that changing face of the high street. Retail is less dominant than it used to be in the 80s and maybe 90s. We've seen the growth of hospitality. We've seen the growth of service retail, barbers, nail bars. John makes a good point, though. Are they really barbers? Are they really nail bars? Or are they operating for some other illicit reason? But we do see that. We've seen that continue. And in all honesty, I suspect that because retail has the challenge of online shopping as well as all the other aspects of trading on a high street, more so than any other sector, then it's likely that we'll lose more retail space. What's important, really important, is that space, when it becomes vacant, is put to good use, is put to positive use, creative use. I think there are opportunities for new industries, new sectors to prosper on the high street, but they need to be given a helping hand. And that's where, once again, if a long-established business has to close because they can't make the model work, why would a new business make it work? That running a high street shop or pub or restaurant or bar, whatever you want to call it, a cafe, your fixed cost base is huge compared to your margin you can make on it. So until we address that, we probably will always have this aspect of 13% vacancies and businesses closing, and a turnover of businesses closing over a short space of time. We shouldn't be afraid of the changing face of a high street. We should look to embrace it, but it needs managing. And I think at the moment, a lot of retailers, large and small, but the smaller ones especially, feel as if they're being cut adrift and manage decline on their own.
Yeah. I mean, John, I've heard it from Andrew there, and you're one of these high street retailers. In fact, you're one of the department stores that have seen probably the biggest cut from 1,700 to 1,000. So what makes it so hard to survive on the high street for you as a department store?
It's exactly what Andrew said. It's fixed costs. Like, yes, you've got internet retailers come in and so on, but actually, I think that part of it is manageable. What's not manageable is all those other costs going up and up and up repeatedly. You know, things like minimum wage. Retailers are a low-paid sector, so when they keep pushing the minimum wage so heavily, that makes a big difference to department stores. A lot of department stores generally are in historic city centres. These buildings are more difficult to work with. They're older. They're not fit for purpose against retail parks, and so they cost more to run. And you know, again, the government aren't, I don't think, recognising the value of department stores, that they give an identity to the high street. They're part of what shapes its character. They're the anchor stores that bring in the footfall, and if you lose your department stores, you tend to then lose other stores around them and the viability of the whole area. So it's really important we keep them, but it's very hard to keep them when those fixed costs are so stacked against them.
And I think the government have announced this high street strategy later this year. And we've got, obviously, given the government's record so far in supporting just pubs and increasing business rates to retail, are you hopeful about this high street strategy?
I try to be honest, but it was announced at the same time as he announced the help for pubs only, and their sauce so to us retailers was, we're doing a strategy for you. And it's so hard to not roll your eyes and be cynical about it, because, you know, a strategy developed over a period of time doesn't replace hard-earned or much needed financial support now. Yeah. And that's the frustration of it all. I think also we do need a strategy, absolutely. We also need to know in government who's responsible for that strategy. I mean, we have in fact, myself and John met our business Minister Kate Dearden, early January. There was no mention of a strategy for high streets in that discussion. We have a small business minister who is not responsible for retail. I think he's behind the strategy, but we also have the Ministry of Housing and Local Government also think they're behind the strategy. So so all I would say, and my big ask from it is, please make it cohesive. Please give us one point of contact. So stakeholders like us, stakeholders like Hospitality UK, stakeholders like British Retail Consortium, anyone else who's got stakeholders and presence and interest in high streets can make an effective contribution to it. We don't have to be overly complex. We don't have to be over clever with it. We don't want to, but let's accept that doing something at scale will be incredibly difficult, because each high street has its own identity and its own way of working, because we are different people in different parts of the country. So it's good to have. I just wish they hadn't announced it at the same time as giving us the news that we weren't getting extra rates help, because it makes it seem like we're going to give something, let's just throw this out. But I think it's an important piece of work that we want to be part of. I'm amazed so far. It's 3 weeks since it was announced. We've had nothing from government about it just yet. And that makes it sound as if it was, what can we do?
Yeah, bit of a knee-jerk reaction. Andrew, I think you've been quite open. You've applauded the support for pubs, but I think your angle is more that you're not applauding the pubs only relief. So what should the government have done instead of just only supporting pubs in your eyes?
Well, there's always, I talked earlier, a complex way of looking at the financial opportunity that business rates gives this government, and an extra £10 billion worth of income over 5 years. I think when you're looking for more money to support your stakeholder businesses, our members, and independent retail in general, you need to come up with a way of helping the government fund it, because we know funding's tight, and everyone wants their £1 billion. It's only £1 billion. Well, there's two things they could do that also help high streets. This is why this is such a big win for us and for the government. And it's all linked with the cheap imports coming into the country. So we have about 1 billion parcels coming into the country, not paying any duty because they're below the low value item threshold of £135. So they're coming in duty free. The sellers register in this country to avoid VAT. And we estimate, this is not our estimate, this is estimate from other online sellers, the likes of Amazon and people like that, think that there's about £800 million worth of VAT fraud through these items coming in from overseas. That's £800 million that the online marketplaces could collect as a matter of course from the sales going through their platforms and give to HMRC. So that's, and
it's not as though other countries aren't doing this, is it?
No, it isn't. No, other countries do that. And on the other side, you've got about 1 billion parcels coming into the country below the duty-free threshold. The government has announced a 4-year plan to close out. That's just too long. Europe are closing it in 2027, but some big countries in Europe, France, Italy, Spain, are introducing a customs handling fee on those parcels.
Right.
So even if we charge £10 at a customs handling fee on 1 billion parcels, you're raising £10 billion. So you're leveling the competition with high streets, you're leveling the competition with physical businesses on high streets compared to overseas sellers on online marketplaces, and you could generate £10.1 billion worth of income. We only need 2.5 billion of that to give us the sort of support we need on business rates and business costs on the high street. There's another 7.5 billion they could use to develop high streets on top of that, and they still have change coming out of it. So it's just it seems a very obvious way of hitting a few birds, killing a few birds at the same time, supporting high streets both in competition ways, trade ways, and also funding ways.
Okay, I might come back to that in a minute, but John, if Rachel Reeves was to ask you as an independent retailer, listen to what Andrew's just said, what would you as a retailer and your fellow retailers, what do you need, and what would you tell the Chancellor now to help?
Well, I would very much welcome the low value import loophole being closed, as Andrew's just said. But the thing that I would really like to see is proper long-term business rates reform. We keep getting sort of bits here, bits there, reduction here. We'll tell you again in 12 months what you're getting next, etc. But you can't plan and invest on that basis. You can't sign long-term leases on your retail units on that basis. You can't invest in infrastructure improvements that you need to get back over 5 and 10 years on that basis. So if we had proper business rates reform, which I believe was a manifesto pledge, but they've yet again just fudged it, that would allow us to invest. But I don't think they seem to understand that we do need that long-term certainty.
Right. So long-term rather than short-term knee-jerk reactions about a strategy. I think, Andrew, obviously I'd ask you perhaps the final question now, that that research from Southampton University suggests that this issue on the high streets and business rates could really determine Labour's electoral fate. You've obviously got some ideas, putting those forward, but do you think all this political pressure will force them to listen?
You would like to think so. I mean, as we speak today, we're not even sure who the leader will be in a few months' time, let alone what a high street will look like. So I guess there's still a lot of turmoil, and that's one of the problems. And that's no one's, what is it? It must be someone's fault, but it's unfortunate that that there's such distractions going on that getting. I complained earlier about not having any contact with anyone about a high street strategy, even though it's 3 weeks ago. But I guess we're all dealing with infighting and dealing with the fallout from Mandelson, etc., in order to deal with that. The reality is that people care about high streets. they really care about high streets. They really care about shops, the sort of shops that John and his family have run for more than 150 years. They really care about having places to go, to socialise, to meet, to feel safe, enjoy, relax, eat, drink, whatever. And I think the danger is that some parts of government think, well, people will buy online instead of going to the high street. That's the way it's going. Everyone's going to buy online. You don't need shops, or you need a lot less shops. I don't think that's the case. 2/3 of all things are still bought in shops. That's been the case since COVID. COVID's on being like that. And it's a very poor society if we don't have somewhere where we can go, walk around, do things, be interested in things, have some noise around us, have some vibrancy that give us a chance to unwind, and retail, hospitality, leisure, all elements of a high street that would allow that to happen.
Yeah, I think there's valid points about people's mental health being able to get out and walk around high streets rather than sit at home ordering online. But John, difficult question for you, having just heard those kind of points, but are you optimistic about independent retail and the future of high streets like Hereford?
Well, I think it's great news that people value them as much as they do, as this survey has shown. And so hopefully that means that long term, they still have a place. But I'm not optimistic that the understanding from the decision makers is there in the short term to get this right. And it may be a case of, trying to just hold things together and get through for a few years until we get what we're already being told will be another change of government, and hopefully one that understands the high street and what drives growth better next time around. Yeah,
I think, look, we could carry this on, but I think obviously the next podcast might cover other issues. But Andrew from Bira and John Jones from Philip Morrison Sons, thank you both for a really open and frank discussion. But thanks to you, our audience, also for listening to High Street Matters. That's an original broadcast series from Bira, the British Independent Retailers Association. And I'd also encourage anyone to visit bira.co.uk if they want more resources about this high street strategy, business rates campaign. But I'm sure we'll be back soon with more insights to try and help independent retailers like John and others thrive. So can I just say, this was High Street Matters, and thanks very much for listening. Bye-bye.